All right. Well, welcome everybody. And as a few others trickle in, we'll get started. But I think it's appropriate to um, uh, start with a prayer. Uh, just give me a second. There's a sound background that's going on. I have to fix my son's microphone before I start recording. So just give me 1 second here. All right. Sorry about that. Let let us pray. Loving God, we thank you for your presence with us tonight and for being with us during this study. As we bring this section of the study to a close, as we explore that last 200 years, be with us in our learning, be with us in the questions that we ask. Surround us with your love and grace. Give us a spirit of learning to help us get a deeper understanding. So be with us tonight, we pray. In Christ's name, amen. All right. Well, welcome. And we are just into just in terms of where we have been and where we are coming through. Of course, last week we talked about it was kind of shining a light on the Dark Ages, but the dominant part of what we were talking about last week was actually saying that the Dark Ages was a misnomer. So much of, at least in from a Western perspective, we focus so much on Western Europe that we really didn't have a solid picture of. We don't get a solid picture from our background of what the development of the Christian church in the East was like, and how it differed significantly from the developments in the Western Church, and those differences actually lead into the main discussion in terms of tonight. And of course, tonight we talk West versus East, um, as much based out of a linguistic difference more than anything else. But we're gonna get to that when we move into it. So, just as a reminder, keep in mind that even though the Roman Empire, as we sort of understand it in terms of governance of the empire from Rome, ended in 476. However, the Eastern Roman Empire, that viewed itself as the Roman Empire, continued as a major political player and would continue to do it for another 1,000 years. Almost just shy of a thousand years. And even though we tend to refer to the Eastern Roman Empire as the Byzantine Empire, they themselves viewed and understood themselves to be essentially the an unbroken line of the Roman Empire, just happening to operate in the eastern regions, and were largely a Greek speaking um, uh, we're a Greek speaking empire. And so the largest part of that Eastern Empire extended in approximately 555 in the under Justinian the First, and then it shrunk to a very small, almost rump state uh, in the aftermath of the rise of Islam in approximately 695 to 717. Um, and as I mentioned just at the beginnings of these slides, is that the Byzantine Empire, as we understood it, or the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire as they would call themselves, would continue right up until even into the beginning of the Reformation. I mean, the Reformation itself is largely considered to have started around 1517, but this puts it within an orbit of a lifespan of the beginning of the Reformation. Um, so as a result, the church in the West and the East, they evolved along these political developments, how the political developments in the East versus what the political developments were in the West. And so during the Justinian's rule, there were five centers of Christian thought. Now, the reality is, I had mentioned these very early on, that there were five centers of Christian thought that developed. That formal establishment was simply a reflection of something that already existed. And those centers were, of course, Rome, Constantinople, Antioch in what is now modern day, on the border between modern day Turkey and Syria. It's actually, like today, it is still considered to be part of Turkey. Alexandria, of course, in Egypt, and Jerusalem, well, being Jerusalem. But the Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem all fell under the governance of the Islamic Caliphate, specifically the Rashidun and the Umayyad Caliphates. And it, just as a reminder, Caliph in Arabic means steward, someone who is charged in looking after the affairs of a given area. That's the term that they used. And so as a result, because you had the removal of Antioch, Alexandria, and Jerusalem, approximately 100 years after the formal establishment of something that had existed for some time, basically the ones that were left, the surviving centers were Rome and Constantinople, and both of them had their own distinct character. Now, that said, Christian thought continued to evolve and exist in Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, but without that direct connection with Constantinople, they sort of developed in their own way. So, of course, the Christian church in Egypt, these days we refer to it as the Coptic Orthodox Church, but really it was the Eastern Church that developed out there. And then the Ethiopian Orthodox is also sort of attached to that, but a little further south, but centered out of Alexandria. And the remnants of those various Eastern Orthodox churches still exist today. However, certain things complicated that. So now what you have, to simplify it, really, so what we have left is we have two power centers. We've got in the West, we have Rome, and in the East, we have Constantinople, and they are evolving in different directions. And so we have the Eastern Church in Constantinople is the official religion of the Roman Empire, but it's always under the authority of the Roman Emperor or the Byzantine Emperor, depending on how you define it. But basically, they are subject to the authority of the emperor. On the other hand, because the political structures of the Roman Empire in the West had been smashed, the Roman Church, on the other hand, didn't have that kind of being under the thumb of anybody else. In fact, they started growing increasingly in power and jurisdiction in their own right. And if anything, so where if you had political power and the church in the West, what you started to have happen in the East, you had the imperial power and the church under that. But in the West, it was almost the inverse, that you started to have because the church itself had its network and connections all throughout Western Europe. it became an extranational organization. So it wasn't subject, it was in relationship with, but it wasn't directly subject with that. And an important development happens in what we're talking about tonight, where that eventually changes. And so again, the other thing was also a major linguistic difference. In the West, they spoke Latin. In the East, they spoke Greek. And it's also, I know that I've said this before. There's been some, some films about the life of Jesus, and it shows the Romans um, in in and around Jerusalem speaking Latin. No, they didn't speak Latin there. They spoke Greek there. Everybody spoke Greek there. Jesus would have spoken Greek there. Um, and so that's just kind of keep in mind. Latin was almost exclusively a Italy and West kind of thing, whereas it was Greek pretty much everywhere east. And so, unfortunately, those linguistic differences also started to have some theological impacts in terms of the discussions that they would have, and some major miscommunications because of that linguistic difference would also come into play. So anyway, let's go back to the Roman Church. And now keep in mind, I'm not going to use the term Roman Catholic Church because that didn't effectively become the Roman Catholic Church really until the Great Schism, where it was defined separate as the Greek Orthodox Church. But this is the church, the Church of Christ as centered in Rome, the Latin-speaking church. Now the thing is, even though they were always connected to the larger church through Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Alexandria, they claimed a certain apostolic authority because they had the tradition that Peter was the first bishop of Rome. Now, historically, that actually is seriously up for debate as to whether or not that's actually historically true or not. But they certainly claimed it, and nobody in the East, in the Eastern centers, disputed that. And so the Bishop of Rome, because of course the whole system, East and West, worked under an Episcopalian, what we now call an Episcopalian hierarchy, where you had the local regions, dioceses, where you had a bishop who was responsible for the affairs inside of that territorial district, and then of course the Bishop of Rome, of course, because Rome was one of the centers of thought, the Bishop of Rome was seen as a first among equals, because basically the bishops in these centers were seen as the patriarchs of their given respective jurisdictions, and so the Bishop of Rome, from early on, claimed recognition as the first among equals, and was often reminding the others that they were the first among equals, much to the chagrin of the remaining centers. And of course, this ended up being amplified, that after the collapse of the Roman civil government in the Italian peninsula and points west, the churches under that Roman jurisdiction found themselves outside of the imperial control. I mean, there was a bit of it back with the Byzantine emperor under Justinian, but that really didn't last long enough to make a lasting effect. So you had the churches in these areas that were not under the imperial control of the Byzantine Empire. In some cases, the church was the only civil authority left, because everything else, the political structure and everything else, was smashed. And so what ended up happening is, in some of these areas, you had the bishops, because they were the only ones left, ended up effectively as the princes of these different city-states. They didn't necessarily, they didn't want it, but they ended up having it. And this makes an important distinction is that you have now the Roman Church stepping into the political vacuum. And it's a very, very important distinction because that never happened in the East. But you now have the Roman Church stepping into that political vacuum of power and authority. And unfortunately, with politics comes corruption. And that's where we're headed. So, following the rise of the Gothic king who had basically smashed Roman authority in the latter half of the fifth century. Following that rise, even though Justinian did manage to get some control during the middle of the sixth century, there was this increasing distance becoming greater and greater and greater. Communication lines began to fall apart because, I mean, the chaos in Western Europe, it meant communications lines broke down, literacy fell, all kinds of you had the fall of the Western Empire, and all of that political structure went with it. So you had these large sections where the Roman Church is responsible for a lot of these sections, but all of a significant number of that, if not most of it, is outside of Byzantine control. Even if the Byzantines technically had control over Rome for a bit of time, Rome had a greater the churches under Roman authority were outside of that political sphere. And so the Western Church became more and more reliant on the protection of the Gothic kingdoms, or there was this interesting development in relationship with it. And so, curiously enough, in about 715 to 757, what you see here. Remember I briefly alluded to that there was a period of anarchy in the Eastern Roman Empire. Coincides with this is that things are going really sideways in the Eastern Roman Empire. So Pope Stephen II said, okay, well, we've got to do something about this. We need to be able to have some more stability here. So they then shifted their political alignment towards the people they were closest to, namely the Frankish kings, to protect the Italian peninsula, so that it started to become this alliance. And so it led to this power shift, is that this growing relationship between the Roman papacy and the Frankish kings, and it came to the development of something particularly at the beginning of the 9th century in 800, where we have Pope Leo III crowning Charles I, or Charlemagne, as he is better known, at least in the history books, as the Roman emperor of a united empire, the Carolingian Empire, on Christmas Day in 800. That was huge because it was Leo himself trying to revive the Roman Empire in the West, because there wasn't this political control or this political relationship. The difference is that it was Leo establishing who was king. The Pope was establishing who was king, as opposed to how the church would be governed as under the supervision of the Byzantine emperor. And so those territories under that united area would eventually become known, even though it is widely recognized that Charlemagne was the first effectively emperor of the so-called Holy Roman Empire. It didn't actually gain that name until after our time period here. So you have that time period there. But it also, Constantinople saw Leo's effort in this as a power play, right? Probably rightly so. And this did not go over well in Constantinople because at the time, arguably, Rome still technically was kind of under some degree of connection and control um, with the Byzantine emperor, but at the same time, the chaos that was happening there, they didn't have that kind of control. So you have Pope Leo III effectively wrestling that political control. So, and what ended up happening from that point on, from 800 on, right up the really pretty much right up into the Reformation, that nobody would be crowned emperor without the Pope's direct blessing and participation. And that would eventually extend to the different kingdoms in Western Europe as well. That basically the Roman Church at this point claimed for itself and did this and then began to claim for itself that it was the legitimizing entity or organization that made each of these crownings in terms of who would be ruler of a given space. As if put it this way, if the blessing didn't come from Rome, it wasn't considered legit. And the Roman Empire or the Roman Church really started to lean into that. And so where we have in the Eastern Empire, still remaining under the thumb of the emperor, all of a sudden now we have the Roman Church and specifically the papacy exercising power over the rulers of the Western Kingdom by saying that your rulership is not legit unless we say it is. So therefore, you now have the Pope effectively being firmly enmeshed in the political structures in the West. And then of course there was also this other bit that I haven't really talked about too much, is that you had certain bishops in certain areas themselves who, by virtue of that, they were the territorial leaders because in a vacuum they were the only ones left, and by necessity, all of a sudden you had raising military forces in order to defend the population that were under the direct control of bishops. And it's, you wonder why in the game of chess, why bishops are a significantly powerful piece in the game of chess. This is why. But unfortunately, this does leave to a problem that you've heard the saying that power tends to corrupt. And it did. And so we're going to explore that with this. And the thing is, this was happening in both East and West, but in different ways. And so because of that enmeshment in politics, keep in mind all throughout this, and I am going to eventually get to this, there were those for whom the church's involvement in politics of any kind was anathema. And yet it was, it still happened, but there were those who distanced themselves from it. And particularly in the West, in the Roman Church, corruption became an increasing problem, and it was bad. It was we think of the question is how bad? Well, let's get into this. In 476, it was kind of forced upon them. But by 861, they loved the power and they continued to amass it, and they didn't want to let it go. And so because of that, because of the papacy's role in giving legitimizing power in the West, it was all infected with the worst kinds of political intrigue, and I'm going to get to some of that. Because I don't know if you there have been TV shows on how on the Borgia dynasty in the 15th century in terms of the papacy and how corrupt it was then. Put it this way, what happened between 867 and 1049 made the Borgias look like angels. It was that bad. So you had this really, really ugly things. And so here's a couple of examples. Now, yeah, I know I'm doing church history here. We are part of this. This is part of our history. But we do need to know how ugly it got. So here's some examples. Generally, for the most part, during this time period, we have the popes either appointed by the predecessors or, importantly, by secular rulers. And of course, because of this, the chance of corruption was high. Good bribe here. And once Charlemagne was in power, and the realization of that legitimizing authority, all of a sudden that risk of corruption just shot through the roof. And so you now had the papacy themselves becoming under the direct influence of Roman families. It was almost well, I'm not even going to say it was almost mafia-like. I mean, there's a reason why the name mafia emerges out of Italy. This way of doing business that effectively was effectively a criminal enterprise, but because they controlled the politics, it wasn't criminal because they were the ones doing it. And so this is actually a legitimate historical term. They actually called this time the Pernocracy. That's how bad it was. And so you have Rome under the control of the family, and this family controlled who got to be pope. And so in this time period, there were 12 popes, or no, if you do the math here, there were 17 popes. 12 of them were murdered, 3 deposed, and two stepped down in a period of less than 60 years. And in that time, 3 of these popes were actually members of this family. And the question is, they weren't even sure, I'm not even sure if they were necessarily ordained until it says, okay, you're going to be pope, so we need to quickly we need to put you through holy orders. Yeah, it's just, and just do that. And so in that period, so even after this period ended, the next almost 100 years wasn't any better. And so then we had and what it was is just which family had the influence. So we have the Theophylacti family from 906 to 963, the Crescenti family from 974 to 1012, and then and the Tusculans from 1012 to 1048. In terms of whichever family was dominant in Rome controlled who was pope, and therefore had enormous influence all over Western Europe. And then it reversed that that you had the Henry III of the Holy Roman Empire, so the Germanic king, then at least for this 11-year period, was appointing popes. Notice I'm saying popes plural here. Okay, in this 10-year period. And then so we have the appointment of Clement II, who was only in there for a year. And then Clement turned around and then crowned Henry as the Holy Roman Emperor. And then but Clement started a series of reforms to try to combat that corruption and those influences of particular families. And so the practice of the conclave began this is where the practice of the conclave then came into play. So, this ancient tradition of the conclave isn't as ancient as we think it is. And so this gathering, in terms of the papal conclave, has been around for less than 1,000 years. It's still a long time, but compared to the overall lifespan of the church. So now, one of the things that we also have to make sure that there's a misnomer for is that the burning of heretics and that putting people to death for their beliefs or lack thereof. Whoops. The reality is, though, heretics, people heretics were people who were sort of seen as not following with the orthodoxy or the confessions of faith, particularly the Nicene Creed. But generally, it became a term of anybody that they didn't like. But generally, if they were put to death, because like that did start to happen around the 5th century, that people, for whatever reason, were singled out and persecuted for having a difference in faith. That when they were executed, generally it was by hanging or some other method. The prospect of burning didn't actually happen until 1022, so very, very late in this period. And again, it was related to politics, but unfortunately, it was a practice that kind of came forward. And burning was something that you did to a witch, not to a heretic, but then they got conflated together. Now, not that I'm saying that any of it was okay. I'm very, very much, anti death penalty, of any stretch, and it boggles my mind that this was actually a thing. But at the same time, that practice of burning people for witchcraft was something that came out of the Gothic cultures, not something that originated in Christianity. It was a Western European practice, and the fear of witchcraft, and I mean that's a whole other thing that we aren't able to cover in this. But it emerged out of the Germanic cultures and practices even pre-Christian. So, and here's the thing: is in the church, at least in the West, outlawed the burning of witches because witches didn't exist, and then somehow they existed again. And so, we see this in the 11th and 12th, the 11th and 12th centuries, curiously enough, coinciding with the beginning of the Crusades. But remember when I said, I talk about all this corruption. I talk about all this ugly stuff going on in the development of the church. But somewhere in here, there were people who were faithful, understanding of God in their midst, in terms of understanding of the presence of Christ and the tangibility of the presence of God, and wanting to be faithful to that and not wanting to deal with the politics with that. And so the question is, where were the faithful? They were there. And so in the midst of all the political stuff going on, there were the faithful, that sort of kept their heads down and kept doing what they were doing, and so the spread of Christianity had very little to do with what was happening at the political level. I mean, yes, the kings, the princes, the bishops may have paid lip service to that at the highest levels, but they were in politics and in intrigue. But those on the ground were really in terms of trying to live out that mission. And so in those small acts of kindness, that's where it was happening, not under edict or imposition or anything else like that. And so in the middle of that, occasionally there were some people who were political players themselves, who themselves tried to get back to that core understanding of the faith. They were disheartened with the court intrigue, and they were trying to take steps to reclaim that original mission. There was always there, and there was this point counterpoint that they were trying to get back to. Um, and so right in the heart of that so-called pornocracy, we have William I, the Duke of Aquitaine, establishing a Benedictine abbey under a monastic order under the order of Saint Benedict, and established this abbey in Cluny in eastern France. And his plan for this, the William himself, he said, I'm going to set this up, and I do not want your because of my political authority, I do not want to be there. This is a conflict of interest for me. Did not so instead of being sort of a patron, but you're effectively paying homage to your to the Lord under which this is built. William didn't want that, and wanted them to have that kind of independence, and so we have an example of one of these faithful, and to to establish this. And so the monastery itself was not under the authority of the local bishop, accountable only to the Pope. But keep in mind, this is in eastern France. This is a good long distance away. So they also tended to sort of, they maintained the influence, but also at a distance. And so and effectively they were under William's protection, but not under William's control. And so because everything, Rome was so centered in terms of the intrigue, is that the monastery itself was left to itself, and to and it became the center of what is known as the Cluniac reforms. And this eventually, this is almost in many respects, this is one of the first, arguably you can say it was the first Reformation of the Roman Catholic Church, but it stayed within the church and didn't break away from, as it would 500 years later. And these Cluniac reforms began to have an influence back through Europe, of trying to get the church to reclaim its original mission and not be involved in this level of corruption. And it took a while, but it emphasized the rule of Saint Benedict in terms of prayer, silence, solitude, that the not getting involved in the court intrigue, but also creating these sanctuary spaces. That the concept of sanctuary became more and more there, and also they became places and centers where the feeding the poor, feeding the hungry, the defending the poor, releasing the captive. That mandate in terms of from Isaiah that we have Jesus reading from, and so and here's the thing, is it put into place something that actually gave authorities pause, is that if you attack the poor, you would be excommunicated. And excommunication was a powerful tool, because if you were excommunicated from communion, which is what excommunication does, is you are not allowed to take communion. and therefore, if you're cut off from that, you are cut off from God. Now, the say what you will in terms of what that actually technically means, but offering that as a protection rather than as and so this was a case of where excommunication was not to use to oppress people, but it was actually used as a protection. It was a shield, um, and called the peace of God. And so there was also the encouragement of pilgrimages uh, to sacred sites in terms of reconnecting with one's faith. And so there were pilgrimages that eventually did, on a very small scale, pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and other sacred sites was also a feature in this movement. And it became the most influential religious movement in Europe in terms of these reforms, but it took time. And the intrigue at the upper levels didn't never fully went away, but it significantly changed and altered the church at the ground level, or at least the practice of Christianity in Western Europe at the individual local level rather than the court intrigue. And so you had the reinforcement clerical celibacy in reaction to those abuses. Even though there are certain things in terms of whether celibacy is a good thing within the Roman Catholic Church. The reason it was established was because of the awful abuses that were happening, particularly during the 9th and 10th centuries. So what you would eventually have is that those Cluniac reforms, they gained favor in Europe. Their impact would be felt well after the time period that we're in. There were also eventually some successor movements, the Cistercians, for example, in the 11th century, the Franciscans in the 13th century. And the thing is, the corruption unfortunately never fully left Rome. And unfortunately, even though these reforms were happening in Europe, still at the high political level, that the corruption that was still there, that would eventually lead to the great split between the Eastern and Western churches. So anyway, this is all happening in Western Europe. And now in Eastern Europe, let's go back east. And so during this time, between 800 and 1054, the Byzantine Emperor never regained the territory nor the influence that it had under the Justinian dynasty. And they were constantly under the existing threat of the various caliphates that had, at least in that first up until about 750, had just that enormously rapid expansion of the rise of Islam. And somehow I just jumped back to the very first slide. So just give me a second here while I pop back to where we're supposed to be. So so under this particular time period, just because of where the things were on the maps, it's referred to as the Macedonian dynasty, but really Macedonia, of course, being in the area on the north end of the Greek peninsula and to the west of Constantinople, and they managed to claim some territory that they lost to the Umayyads, and because the Abbasid dynasty that followed the Umayyads wasn't able to hold on to that in Asia Minor, and they were able to regain some of that. And they kept the Abbasids at bay for a while, and under that, the church in Constantinople were themselves struggling in terms of dealing with the sense of iconoclasm. In other words, that whole thing of, do we have icons or not? Because there became this belief that we lost all this territory because God was mad at us, and they started focusing on whether or not to use icons. Now, ultimately, in the Eastern Orthodox traditions, plural, that they retained, and that's become actually a very much almost a central part of their methods of spirituality. But at this point in time, that iconoclasm was still pretty strong. And of course, at this point in time, the Eastern Church was almost exclusively speaking Greek. The Western Church is almost exclusively speaking Latin, with and having and the people who were knowledgeable enough of the differences between the languages, and people who spoke both, was pretty uh, was pretty rare. And so there became this just growing divide of cultures between the Eastern and Western Church. Hi, Betty. Welcome.
Better late than never, I
Hey,
guess.
no worries, and it is being recorded,
Hmm.
so we're good. So anyway, with everything that's happening in the West, we now have back in the East, of course, in the East, because the church as a whole is still seeing itself as a whole. The church in Constantinople did not like the fact that the Roman Church had begun to ally themselves with the Frankish kings, who were often at times antagonistic to the Byzantines, the Byzantine the rulers. And this was just happening in the church. Never mind what the Byzantine rulers thought of this. Um, and so the uh, and we have uh, Leo the Third had pushed back and had reclaimed Rome by 740, and but at the same time, the politics within the Byzantine Church themselves were focusing. They wanted to earn favor with God in hopes of keeping the caliphates at bay. Um, and that was their focus. The Eastern Church was focused on issues even further east, which were completely out of the realm of the Western Church at the time. And of course, the Western Church, because they didn't have to deal with really, aside from what was kind of happening in Spain, um, they didn't really view it in the same way. And so, in the West, where the use of iconography, even though it looked differently, but with different statues and images of the Virgin Mary, for example, and things like that, that became an irritant between the East and West. And for the most part, Rome just ignored it. It's like, this isn't our thing. We're going to ignore it altogether. And so we have the power of the Roman Church going up, and the Byzantine Church becoming more and more insular, and with their power waxing and waning, along with the political fortunes of the Byzantine Emperor themselves, because the Byzantine Empire protected them effectively, whereas in the Rome had largely effectively, because they had control, that protection um, wasn't so much an issue, because they were able to almost dictate policy. And so this cultural divide between the two was just a recipe for a split. I mean, effectively, the two churches had been going in different directions for a very long time. And so, of course, and there's also the irritant, because from a very early time, the Roman Church, insisting that the Pope was to be recognized as the first among equals, that was a bad thing. The political machinations with the Frankish kings that were outside of the Byzantine influence, that was seen as a suspect. And because you're dealing with, effectively, you're fraternizing with the enemy, so to speak. And then, of course, in the different councils of the church, in terms of deciding different things about doctrine and theology and that kind of thing, that were happening in the Eastern Church, the Roman Church sort of would, like, they'd participate, but not really, and um, uh, And then, of course, the language barrier also made a huge difference. And for example, one of the major things here was in the language of the Nicene Creed in Greek versus what it was in Latin. That there is a nuance in a translation that is known as the filioque, in terms of the relationship between Jesus and God as creator. And even though in the Latin language, they wouldn't see, well, it's a difference, whereas the Greek speaking church did, is that the translation didn't quite so if translating it from Greek into Latin seemed to go okay, but if you then took the Latin and then translated back into Greek, it said something else, which made a theological difference. And this is an example of the loss of nuance in translation, and they began to be entrenched around it. And so, because the Roman Church started using the Nicene Creed, the Latin translation of the Nicene Creed, since the 6th century, but it wouldn't be formally recognized as official doctrine until 1014. And because of that difference, that became more and more an irritant and a split between the two, even though realistically that's not much of a difference. And honestly, to explain what that theological difference is very difficult in terms of, does in terms of the concept of the Trinity, are they all equal, or does Jesus kind of come out of the Father, or how does that work? And that translational difference became more and more an irritant and a potentially serious theological issue, even though from an individual perspective, that didn't work. So all of this total up together, these different paths, the two surviving areas, what were referred to as seas, they had already gone in different directions, but everything would come to a head in 1054. And so what ended up happening in 1053, because of these differences, the ecumenical patriarch of the Constantinople, Michael I, this is basically the equivalent of the Pope in Constantinople. So we have the Pope in Rome, the Bishop of Rome. Basically, this is the Bishop of Constantinople, but also, and because those centers of Christianity, is that effectively the Pope is the Patriarch of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople. So Michael I closed all Latin-speaking churches in the city, just just straight closed, because they were under his authority. Latin is no longer to be used. And of course, in this case, because the Roman Church was forcing Greek-speaking churches in southern Italy to close or to conform to the Latin worship, to worship in Latin. So it was a tit for tat kind of thing. And unfortunately, Leo IV then sent a delegation to go to the Patriarch of Constantinople, and to say, no, that order for closing the Latin churches in Constantinople, it won't stand. I don't. And that then and to insist that he recognizes the Pope's claim as the head of all churches. And you can see how well this is going to go over in Constantinople. And but at the same time, even though this was the case, the Pope was actually looking to seek help from the Byzantine Emperor for help against by the way, all one of the things that I've left out of this whole equation is that Western European kingdoms were incredibly warlike. They were constantly fighting with each other all the time, which actually leads into the Crusades. But they were constantly fighting with each other, and 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 quite often the Roman Church were trying to be peacemakers, or at least negotiators in this, but it didn't always go well. And the Normans, who are, of course, you think Norman as being northern Europe. Well, they had come all the way down through the Mediterranean and effectively had invaded southern Italy and claimed all that territory for themselves. And so they were actually looking for some degree of help, but it doesn't, for what happened, it didn't seem that like this was actually part of the mission. And so, the Patriarch of Constantinople said, no, I mean, you've forced the Greek-speaking churches in southern Italy to go to Latin. It makes sense that any Latin-speaking churches here now need to work in Greek. And the delegate, this cardinal, out of spite, excommunicated the patriarch of the Church of Constantinople. In other words, you had effectively someone who was an underling working on behalf of the Bishop of Rome, saying to someone who is his superior, "You are excommunicated." And so, of course, immediately turns around, the Patriarch of Constantinople immediately turns around, excommunicates the head, the delegate, the cardinal here, excommunicates him and anybody who's with him. And of course, realistically, was there any legality to this? Very questionable. And here's the other thing: is that Pope Leo the Fourth actually died while Cardinal the Candido was on his way to Constantinople. So effectively, the Cardinal was acting entirely on his own. And of course that retroactive excommunication only applied to the group that came to Constantinople, not to anybody else, just that group. However, but effectively this happened in 1054, and effectively that the excommunication of that group was perceived as being the excommunication of the entire Latin speaking church. And that was the split, and it became worse during the Crusades. And of course, it remains in place today, although these days, of course, the efforts of ecumenical cooperation is far, far, far higher today than it has been in the past 1,000 years. And so that's where we've kind of ended up. So what I wanted to do with this is that that's how we got here. I started the first session talking about how, where we're going. Well, all of that for the past 5 weeks. This is how we got here. But I wanted to talk about some things that we're going to take, that I hope you take away from this, from tonight. But did you have any questions before I get into this section? Wait, okay. So here's some things I'm kind of hoping you take away from this part of the study, is that Christianity grew and spread primarily through personal contact and relationships from the get-go. And yet, at the same time, probably the fastest that Christianity ever grew probably might have been, I think we estimated somewhere about 3.5 to 4% per year, in terms of its overall growth, spread, and pattern. And of course, if you think of ongoing exponential growth, that it does, it accelerates over time as more and more people come in contact with it, through personal contact and relationships. And keep in mind that the population growth during this time period was about 0.5%. So it was not nearly the same degree of growth in pre-industrialization or in early industrialization, where the population growth spikes, or what we're in now in terms of where the exponential growth is. And the whole thing in terms of the questions of identity, belief, who are we? These were serious issues right from the early days of the church. As Christianity tried to remain true to its roots in terms of understanding Jesus as fully human and fully divine, what does that mean? That the God we worship, or God as we worship God, is the creator of the world, the universe around us, and this isn't sort of a multi-tiered thing where an evil God created the worlds and we're just imprisoned divine sparks, as the Gnostics would have us posited, and kind of hijack the image of Jesus for that. But at the same time, because of all those competing ideas and trying to understand who we were, that left the lasting fingerprints in terms of trying to understand who they were. That question continued to linger, but it got sort of meshed into, at least at the organization, the high organization level of who had control. Whereas in its original intent, the thing is, what do we believe, and what is authentic? And it's fine to say, to do this, but please do not hijack this story and present your version of it as being the truth. That was at least the initial intention of what the creeds and that kind of thing were supposed to do. And at the same time, while Christianity becoming the official religion in the Roman Empire made the spread evil, made that spread easier, because there was a sanction to it. People could put up buildings, that kind of thing. It did make it easier, but it also brought in the enormous dangers of becoming mixed up in politics, and that would dominate at the leadership level for almost the entirety of the second half of this period, right through, from the 5th century forward. And so that became increasingly more and more difficult. And yet at the same time, under all this, there were still people in the midst of this who were dedicated to the core principles of faith. So in other words, authentic Christianity, in terms of being faithful to what Jesus preached, did manage to persist in some way, shape, or form even at the base level, even if it wasn't working at the political level. And people continue to remain faithful, and that remains true today. We can state all kinds of examples of where it hasn't worked, where it isn't working, and yet at the same time, there are many examples of where it is. And so at the same time, if there's a theme, like whether or not you were with the Revelation study or with this one, is the dangers of mixing politics and religion is if there's an overall arcing theme with that, is the dangers of that. And this kind of, if anything, the study of history is important, because it's as much of learning wisdom from, but it's also cautionary tales against, and how we can become better, how we can become better people, how we can become better at trying to follow Christ. But also at the same time, there was no one ideal period in which, if we just get back to that particular period, because there was always that full range of mixed of humanity in the midst of all that. And yet at the same time, there were at each of these points in time people who tried to remain faithful, but they were often uh, they were often floating under the radar. And small reforms and change. Like, for example, the Cluniac reforms was a grassroots movement that moved from the bottom up. It wasn't a top-down imposition, for example. And it had a cycle, an ebb and a flow. And as it gained more and more influence, it began to struggle with what that influence was. But there was this constant, this, these movements would come up, and then there would be another one that would come up in relation to it. And curiously enough, that actually, kind of casting our eyes forward to the idea of in the Reformation, the John Calvin, uh, one of probably there are many things about Calvin that even though was ordained Presbyterian, many things about Calvin that I would say that, I don't, he didn't get it right. But one of the things that I think he did get it right, both him and John Knox, and many of the reformers said that the church, they referred to themselves as the reformers, but they believed that the church should be reformed and reforming. That there's never a point where we would get it all right. We have to constantly be reforming ourselves to adapt to what God is calling us to be, and changing and constantly reforming. And unfortunately, many Reformed churches, basically, they stopped at Reformed, were Reformed, they stopped there and didn't continue what Calvin and Knox said. We need to constantly be reformulating and understanding ourselves in this. So there was always those movements underneath. But that said, just with this last point here, is that I'm hoping this also gives the historical background of how we got to the movement of Jesus to basically what we have here is the split between East and West and the dawn of the Crusades. And of course, one of the next study that I am going to offer, probably in January, because Epiphany is really, really long this year. So I was thinking sort of mid to late January that I would actually, if you want to follow me on this, is come and take a trip through the Crusades. And so that's going to be what I hope to offer, probably starting about third week of January. But I'll have to kind of get things organized for that. But that's sort of what I'm planning. Now, so that's basically basically the presentation tonight, little over an hour. So now if you have any questions from any of the sessions that we've done over the past 4 weeks, or the past 5 weeks, consider this be Stump the Minister. So if you've got any questions at all, please let me have it.
I've got a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Betty.
So what would be considered the first church, Roman Catholicism or Greek Orthodox?
Yes. Although in truth, really, in terms of the what is closer to what the early church looked and worshipped like, Greek Orthodox is closer than Roman Catholicism in terms of its overall practice. There's a document that was in terms of what the earliest church used to sort of organize itself in terms of how it would worship, that dates to the first century. It's called the Didache. It's one of the books that never actually it was considered to be a Christian, definitely with it never made the canon of scripture, so to speak, but it was close. And it's not something hiding in a vault someplace. I mean, there's a text we can do that, but it gives instructions on things like how to baptize someone, how to organize, and it's all written in Greek. So and in terms of what the worship practice is like. And those strains are still present in Eastern Orthodox forms of worship. Um, and whereas of course Latin, so everything started in Greek and then was translated into Latin. So uh, but the early church, we know there were Christians operating in Rome as early as approximately, you know, uh, 40 to 50 common eras. So within a decade or two of the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ. So there were churches that were there, or church. When I say churches, I'm not talking buildings. I'm talking groups of people um, that did develop their own practices. But I mean, in terms of that, if there was one to say, if there's one that kind of leans closer to what the original would be like, it would lean more towards Greek Orthodox. But the reality was, Christianity was spreading all in small, tiny little pockets all over the East Empire. Rome being one center, but also all the way around the shores of the Aegean Sea. Does that help, Betty?
I'm not sure, but uh, I always thought it was the Greek Orthodox that
Yes.
was, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, put it this way: if I'm forced to choose, yes, I would say the Greek Orthodox would definitely be, like, in terms of, if you were to walk into a church in the first century, what would it feel like more? It would probably feel closer to it would be closer to Greek Orthodox, but more informal.
Okay.
The formalization would come over time, whereas the practices, the rituals and rites in the Latin speaking church would come later, once some of that formality became more and more established. So, like, if I have to lean anywhere, I will lean Greek Orthodox, but with an asterisk.
Thank you.
No worries. Mm. So now, Beryl, I saw yours came on. Did you have a question from her earlier?
No, I probably pushed a button by mistake.
No worries. You're allowed to. And I know, Richard, you often have questions. If you've got them, fire away.
No, actually, I'm gonna have to mull this over and get back to you on it
Okay, we'll do. That's
because that was a lot of information.
yeah, and the one thing that I do apologize. Again, here's the fire hose. Hopefully you got a little wet. But I mean there, and some of this, like, keep in mind, I only did five sessions. Any one of these sessions could be an entire course at university of just dealing with it's funny. When I was doing my history degree, the first year courses would do these grand arcs over large and long periods of time, and that's more akin to what this is. And the more history that you took, the shorter the time periods would become, right down to the point where I think there was one course that I took in my fourth year of university in my history degree, that was just on the Battle of Passchendaele, just the Battle of Passchendaele, which lasted for a handful of months, really, or weeks, if depending on how you count it, in 1917. One whole full semester course, 3 sessions a week, just on the Battle of Passchendaele. And I mean, that's getting into full depth. Here, we're still in orbit. So there's many, 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 many details that I've just kind of barely skipped over and touched, and hopefully having given a larger picture. I know a few of you have said that at the end of it, you kind of feel like your brain is full.
Used.
Yeah, and yeah, I see you, Marilyn, and that's fine. Because I know what that feeling was like because I was on the receiving end of it when I went through this. And my hope, if nothing else, is just to kind of give you the overall arc, and that you might remember something in it, and if you want, but that it evokes questions as well, and that there may be more out there um, to ask.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Marilyn.
The difference in the churches, like some of the churches when I went on the river cruise, some of them were they were all huge, but some were very, very plain. And then the others just all the gold and decorating and things in the ceiling and all over. Yeah.
Yep.
Now, who's who?
Okay, well, that's a good question. Where was your cruise?
The Danube down, yes, from
Okay.
uh,
So where did you start and where did you finish?
oh dear, okay. We Prague down,
Okay.
yes, down in that area, yeah, to the end of the Danube.
Yeah. So coming out on the
Yeah,
so you would be coming out onto the Black Sea, correct?
yes.
Okay. Well, of course, the further upriver you go, you will get into areas that at least at one point or another would be dominantly Roman Catholic, and then you'd be moving through areas that would become what are effectively Eastern Orthodox. But at that point in time, one of the other things that I haven't talked about too much is that the Eastern Greek-speaking Orthodox, as much as they were very conservative in terms of their liturgy and form, the Eastern Orthodox churches were actually quicker than the Western Latin-speaking church to adopt to local languages. And that's why you have a Serbian Orthodox church, a Ukrainian Orthodox church, a Russian Orthodox church, a Romanian Orthodox church. But they're all connected to the Greek-speaking the Greek-speaking rites. They were quicker to translate, but their liturgies remain very much the same. And so the further downriver that you would go, the more and more you would encounter these various the Orthodox churches. I don't necessarily have it here, but you've probably heard the term a Gothic like Gothic church. And generally, if you're in the West and you think of an old European church, you are thinking of a great big Gothic structure that has
Yeah.
that has those arched windows, those very high towers, those and these certain motifs and patterns in it, these great big flying buttresses. That was an architectural feature of the specific to the West, whereas the churches in the East, they were very much a different structure, and they actually drew. Actually, Richard, we were talking about this. What is now known as the Hagia Sophia, which was originally built as in Constantinople. It was called the Church of God's Wisdom. And then after the Turks like it was built 5th century, I believe, an enormous structure considered to be one of the architectural wonders of the day. And when the Turks took Constantinople, they turned it into a mosque. And yet the physical structure of it remained actually the model in which most of the Eastern churches, the physical churches that were built, as to what they would look like. And some of that did have that iconography in there, although depending on where you went, some of it had to do a lot with local culture as well. Like of course, the famous Sistine Chapel, but that was of course painted during the Renaissance in Rome, and so and lots and lots of colors, lots and lots of drawings and things like that. Whereas other places, the iconoclasm in terms of the keeping it simple and plain, and that might have been reflective in the Orthodox churches for a period, but they do have a lot of these colorful icons, but the physical architecture is very different than the Gothic architecture of Western Europe. I mean, talking about architecture is an entire, we could do a whole course on that too. Does that help, Marilyn?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, because basically your cruise was going basically from Roman areas that were dominantly Roman Catholic that may actually be Protestant, largely Protestant now, or Lutheran, and then down through areas that were increasingly Orthodox. So,
Yeah.
Betty,
We ended up in Budapest.
Yeah.
So Budapest from
Yeah.
the other one. Yeah.
So okay. Yeah, and actually, curiously enough, one of the Hungarians, if they're not, the Hungarian church actually tends to there's a sizable chunk of Protestantism, specifically one that is related to the Presbyterian perspective, that it has a fairly strong base in Hungary. So Betty, I saw your face again.
Yeah, no, I was just pushing buttons I shouldn't have.
Oh, that's okay. You're allowed to. I was just making sure. So, all right. Yeah, curiously enough, what's been interesting with this is we've also had there have been a number of people who've been joining us after the fact in terms of watching this. So, for those of you who have been watching this and don't have an opportunity to ask questions, or if there are questions, please email them to me. And for those of you who are attending and you have other questions, I mean, Richard, I know you'll corner me at some point at the church and ask me, which is great. Just go ahead and do that. But I'm always happy to address and ask this. And I guess the question is this: when I originally designed this course, it was intended to be as a background, as a standalone background on its own, but it does eventually dovetail into the Crusades, because the first Crusade happens only about 50 years after the Great Schism that happens in 1054. So the first Crusade basically starts about halfway through the last decade of the 11th century, and that's where we are here. So if you're willing to follow along, although one thing that I do recommend, not so much for any degree of historical accuracy, but for the insanity that it is please take some time and go watch Monty Python's and the Holy Grail. Because that might get you into the mindset, certainly of what is the first Crusade. Not to make light of all the dark stuff that happens in there, but to realize what centuries, as I mentioned, that we had during the Roman Empire, the literacy rate was 15 to 20% during the Roman period, and certainly even in the Byzantine. In the Byzantine Empire, literacy was still relatively high, but in the West, literacy drops to 6%, and what you have of centuries of ignorance, effectively, of the leads to some of the both hilarious and tragic elements of that during the Crusades, and we get to explore it. We do get to explore that. And as everything that, nothing here is black and white. There is a complex history to it, and I'm not trying, and I'm hoping that we learn something more about that. So that's I'll probably I haven't got a firm start date, but it'll likely be Monday nights in during the latter part of Epiphany, because Lent does not start until the beginning of March. So I'd be looking at January, late mid-January through to the end of March, or sorry, to the end of February, approximately, barring certain holidays that happen on Mondays during February. Okay, so I wanted to say a special thank you for everybody who came and joined. Richard, you just unmuted yourself.
Yeah, that's because I was going to say thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Will do. And for those of you who haven't seen it, Richard and Guy were hard at work over the past 2 days of making the front of the sanctuary look absolutely amazing for Advent. I can't wait for everybody to see it. It's really, really good. So and wonderful. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording. Okay, so just stopping the recording.